Hello, this is David Bernstein, founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. JILV supports the free expression of ideas and opposes the imposition of critical social justice ideology inside and out of the Jewish community. We are pleased to co-sponsor this event, New Paradigms in Black-Jewish Relations, with Free Black Thought, a small but growing group of scholars, technologists, parents, and American citizens determined to amplify vital Black voices that are rarely heard on mainstream platforms. Check out the new Journal of Free Black Thought, which you can find on their website, freeblackthought.com. Today, we turn our attention to fresh approaches in Black Jewish relations. And for that, we have a distinguished panel who I'm going to introduce. First, we have Eric Smith, who's founder of Free Black Thought, a professor of rhetoric. Dr. Smith is associate professor of rhetoric at York College of Pennsylvania and a writing fellow for Heterodox Academy. His latest book, A Critique of Anti-Racism in Rhetoric and Composition, was recently published by Lexington Press. Next, we have Dr. Brandy Shafutinsky. Brandy is an educator, social worker, and writer and advocate. She has worked towards advancing the rights of victims of and survivors of domestic violence and assault. She is also, I am proud to say, a JILV board member. She's Jewish herself with kids living in Israel. Last but not least, we have David Ben Moshe. David grew up in Maryland where he had a troubled youth. He was in a drug gang, which led to an eventual jail sentence. While there, he met somebody studying a book with a script he did not recognize. That encounter set David on a journey that eventually led him to Orthodox conversion, yeshiva study, marriage, and the battle to be permitted to live in Israel. Today, he is a writer and a personal trainer, and I expect great things from him. As for me, I've been engaged in Black Jewish understanding and collaboration my entire professional life and could not be more excited about this conversation. We will begin the conversation with me offering some context as I see it and a set of propositions for what a new paradigm in Black Jewish relations might look like. Our panelists then will respond. So let's get started. First, some context. For nearly a century, Blacks and Jews were allies in the struggle for civil rights and equality in America. Sometimes risking their lives, they waged battle in the courts, at lunch counters, and in the academy. Their historical partnership culminated in the landmark court decisions and legislation of the 1960s, achievements for which both communities can be proud. As the Black Power movement grew in prominence and made civil rights a racial movement, shutting many Jews out, and as many Jews moved out of the cities away from their Black neighbors and into the suburbs, the relationship between the two communities deteriorated. In recent years, it's become even more complicated. Nation of Islam Minister Louis Farrakhan, who has made anti-Semitic views clear, has been lauded by some in the Black community and condemned by many in the Jewish community. Farrakhan's standing has been a source of ongoing tension. More recently, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, which many Jews wholeheartedly embraced, has provided a new platform for anti-Jewish and anti-Israel sentiment. Some in the Black Lives Matter movement accuse white American Jews of being complicit in white supremacy, and some progressive Jews, eager to be in their good graces, parrot these charges. In October 2016, I wrote an article arguing that Jews should engage in criminal justice reform, which I regarded as the civil rights movement of our time. And I argued that it was crucial that Jews remain proximal to Black activists in engaging social issues. I ended the piece with the following observation. It will not be easy integrating the Jewish community into civil rights coalitions, some of which hold very different political sensibilities. Young activists routinely invoke phrases like white supremacy to describe Americans' prevailing power structure, and this may sound extreme to many mainstream Jews. Rather than feeling obliged to use these terms, however, the Jewish community can develop its own social justice vocabulary and come to the table in its own voice. Well, I was wrong, it turns out. It became apparent to me in the ensuing years that the civil rights movement of our time, such as it is, demanded not devotion to a common social agenda, but complete ideological uniformity and consensus. One cannot easily join criminal justice reform coalitions, I discovered, without professing total deference to a doctrine of racial essentialism. The drive for ideological conformity, in my view, is not good for Blacks, Jews, or the country at large. We need a new paradigm in Black-Jewish relations. And so I'm going to offer a few propositions for discussion. One, neither the Black community nor the Jewish community are monolithic. We are highly diversified politically, ideologically, and economically. There is no reason why we should allow radical voices in either community to define all of Black-Jewish relations, or that we should deem divisive figures the authentic representatives of our communities. Jews and Blacks that share a set of values and ideological commitments can and should work together. Two, the greatest issue of the day is the health of our liberal democracy. It forces on the far left and on the far right continue to chip away at the foundations of our democratic republic and undermine healthy discourse. Both communities will suffer for it, along with countrymen of all races and religions. Blacks and Jews have played a crucial role in helping America live up to its own highest ideals, and we have an indispensable role ensuring America does so in the future. Three, as heirs of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, now is the time for us to recommit to Dr. Martin Luther King's original vision of a colorblind society so that our children will, in the words of the great civil rights leader, quote, one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. But until that time, we have work to do. Four, there are real social issues that need resolving, our criminal justice system among them. Blacks and Jews who share an agenda on important social issues can and should come together to address them. There should not be ideological litmus tests attached to engaging in such change as there are now. For the person in jail and his family on low-level drug charges, it matters much less whether the drug laws were intentionally put in place to oppress Black people than it does that they are fixed by people of goodwill, no matter what they believe about systemic racism. And finally, five, in many ways, this new paradigm in Black-Jewish relations is not new at all, but deeply embedded in our historical consciousness. It is up to us to revive this historical bond and paradigm and to apply a new old paradigm to the challenges of today. So those are my propositions, and I'd like to start with my friend Eric Smith, the head of Free Black Thought, founder of Free Black Thought, to respond and to expand and to agree or to hopefully disagree with me as well. So Eric.
Thank you for letting me go first. As the apparently one non-Jew here, I need to explain why I'm here and also address the propositions. Proposition one is all about viewpoint diversity, which is what I and my co-founders at Free Black Thought are all about, especially in the Black community. Propositions 2 and 3. The greatest issue of the day is the health of our liberal democracy, and the points about Martin Luther King's colorblind ideology. They speak to the concept of merit, right? If you enter into any critical race theory circle, proponents of critical race theory or something comparable to critical race theory, you will see that merit is demonized, right, as a kind of insidious ploy to maintain white supremacy. So if Jews are as successful, if not more so, than white people in various ways, they're implicated in what's called systemic racism. I think that's a problem for various obvious reasons. Your fourth proposition about real social issues speaks to the need for pragmatism in dealing with civil rights issues, agreeing upon a goal and figuring out the steps to get there collaboratively, right? I think that's missing from a lot of contemporary activism, especially anti-racism. And lastly, number 5 reminds me of the concept of memes, not internet memes, not Facebook and things like that. I'm going way back. Richard Dawkins defined memes as an idea or a behavior that replicates virally in a culture, right? If not an entire society. And I fear that within a lot of African American circles in the United States, anti-Semitism is becoming a meme, right? It's a way of kind of virtue signaling to a large degree. We see a lot of celebrities who are either outright anti-Semitic or, adjacent to anti-Semitism. One of my favorite team is the Philadelphia Eagles, and just Deshaun Jackson, a wide receiver, a good one when he's healthy, said some questionable things about the Jewish community, and you know, some people, rightfully, disowned him for that, but many people did not, and other people started echoing those sentiments. And I fear that anti-Semitism is going to become one of the values, attitudes, and beliefs of African American discourse. And that's why I'm here, because I'm interested in all those things, and I want to make sure that last thing definitely does not happen.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. Let's turn to Brandy for her thoughts.
Well, first, I want to say thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to be part of this conversation. I want to focus on the third point you made about Dr. King's idea of color blindness. And I think what we're seeing is actually a result of color blindness. The idea that we have to be the same to get along, instead of actually acknowledging differences as being something to celebrate in diversity. And I think that that's possibly one of the reasons why Jews are painted as white. There hasn't been real conversation about the diversity of different communities. Everything has been viewed through this monolithic prism that I think allows false narratives to perpetuate through different communities. And I think that right now, looking at leaders of so-called social justice movements, they're of a certain generation that grew up and were schooled in ideas of color blindness, so much so that it erases the idea of differences as a positive versus a negative. And we're seeing, instead of social justice, social vengeance.
Powerful. We'll have to get back to that idea of whether color blindness is the right new paradigm or the wrong paradigm, and whether we need a different form of diversity. But before we do that, let's go to David Ben Moshe.
Yeah, thank you for having me. As you can hear, I'm a little bit hoarse today. I lost my voice a few days ago, kind of with two young kids. Just diseases seem to always be going around. But thank you for having me. The first thing I want to talk about is a piece that you brought up in the context section that I want to push back on a little bit, which is that criminal justice reform is the civil rights movement of our generation. I think that's definitely true for America, but not on a world scale. And I think we have this conversation. It's important to remember that as the world becomes more globalized and different countries start interacting, that we can't just think of America as the only set of problems, especially when it comes to Black and Jewish relationships, because in addition to the relationship that Israel and the Jews have with America, there's also the relationship between Israel and the Jews with many, many countries in Africa, which are also full of Black people. Going into the propositions, I overall agree with them. Going with the first proposition, I like to always bring up one of the big differences I see between the Black community and the Jewish community. As someone who's Black and Jewish, I believe that we need to get to this point of colorblindness, which is a great goal that Martin Luther King stated, and that is in the later points, where the color of my skin does not matter. On the other hand, I think it's always important that my Jewish identity is a part of me. And the real difference I see between those two identities is I see my Jewish identity as an inclusive identity and my Black identity as an exclusive identity. And what I mean by that is Black is a social construct that does not allow others to enter into it, and therefore is very easily used as a tool of division. For example, Eric brought up at the beginning that like, oh, I'm the only one on this who's not Jewish, but in 5 years' times, he could be. On the other hand, you, David, there's no process you could do to become a Black person or an African American, and that is a big difference between the two identities, which is one of the reasons why this color blindness with these unchangeable, unwelcoming identities is not the direction that the human race needs to be going.
Interesting. Eric, there's been a lot of talk in our circles about whether color blindness is the right paradigm for now, or whether it's a distant future aspiration, whether but we need, in the meantime, racial consciousness in order to get to that point so that we can ameliorate some of our past and current disparities. What do you think about that? Both David and Brandy went different directions on the issue of colorblindness. Where do you fall?
I want to re-acknowledge that colorblindness is a metaphor, right? And not a literal thing. Nobody's walking around thinking that people are translucent. The whole point of colorblindness is to minimize partiality, right? It's to, whether I like you or hate you has nothing to do with your skin color. That's the point of colorblindness. Whether you get this job or not doesn't depend on your skin color, right? It depends on your ability to do the job. And for that reason, I embrace colorblindness. You can be colorblind without ignoring people's identities and differences and things like that. You can acknowledge those identities and differences, but you're colorblind in that person's merit, that person's skill, right? That person's usefulness for the job does not depend on immutable characteristics like skin color.
Brandy, you raised this issue. What did you think about what Eric just stated?
I think that that's brilliant, and that's the point. When people use, "Oh, I'm colorblind," it's I don't see color. Like, I'm not acknowledging your difference, because if I did, that would mean I would have to treat you differently. And I think that that's an important part to bring up. It's not that I don't want somebody to see that I am a Black woman. I am. I'm proud of it. It's something to me that I embrace. And like Eric mentioned, that doesn't mean that I should be judged or excluded from positions of professional positions, from spaces in academia, et cetera, because I'm a Black woman. But anytime the conversation comes up, I'm always, "Oh, I don't see color," and I'm like, "Well, that's part of who I am. You're telling me to my face that you don't see a piece of me, because if you did, it would be a problem." I take issue with that.
Interesting. Well, I'm glad we fleshed that out a little bit. I don't think you don't hear, again, in the spirit of free Black thought, we're trying to platform voices and ideas that you don't often hear in the public sphere. And I think this is a very interesting and rich example of that. I want to turn to the issue of sort of racism and anti-Semitism for a moment. And I think I'll start with anti-Semitism. I'm been a long time, as I said before, interlocutor with Black community and Black Jewish relations. And over the years, especially before Black Lives Matter movement sort of came into the public sphere, we talked a lot about Louis Farrakhan. I remember the Million Man March, which became a major issue between Jews and Blacks. There were a few Black leaders who refused to participate in it because they didn't want to hurt their friends in the Jewish world. But many thought that this was unfair on the part of the Jewish community to highlight Farrakhan's anti-Semitism when the much more compelling issues were on the table at the Million Man March. I want to start with, let's say, for David. I know you were probably a young guy during those times, but how did you, over time, come to see the Million Man March and the issue of Black anti-Semitism?
Especially when it comes to statements like those that come from Farrakhan. It is, to me, a clear example of an unacceptable double standard. Anti-Semitism must be fought in every way possible. Racism must be fought in every way possible. Just because someone is speaking about racism, them holding anti-systemic views is an important factor, because it shows that they are a hypocrite, that they are really going out for the things that benefit them instead of recognizing the challenges that face other communities.
Brandy, how about you?
I've questioned for years how anyone would lift up Farrakhan as any type of leader. It's not just his anti-Semitism, it's his misogyny, it's his homophobia, et cetera, et cetera. When he makes statements that the likes of David Duke agree with, he can't be representative of the Black community, regardless of how diverse we are.
Eric?
I think when looking for leaders in a community, you embrace the person who's out there, who's extroverted, who tells it like it is, and things like that. We know how attractive of a trait that is in this country, telling it like it is. Unfortunately, Farrakhan is one of those people to a lot of African Americans. I remember around the time of the Million Man March, how systemic Farrakhan was in the hip hop world. I remember Professor Griff from Public Enemy agreeing with Farrakhan and saying some anti-Semitic things. He got kicked out of Public Enemy for it, right? But he was also, kind of a voice of many African American hip hop fans at the time. So yes, that is definitely a problem. I am not a fan of Farrakhan in many ways. And the fact that he is considered a leader, the fact that, rappers are considered leaders, in such a, important way, I think is an issue. I mean, we have to start listening to academics. That's not a plug for myself. I'm just saying, and other thought leaders who have done this research, who have looked into it and things like that, and not just celebrities or polarizing figures like Farrakhan.
So one of the things that I pushed a little bit in my propositions was this idea that that Blacks and Jews have an opportunity to fight for a liberal society, that we bring with us a history of fighting for justice. And the way that that's being expressed in the public sphere now is generally a fight against systemic racism. Is there also an argument to be made that Jews and Blacks should be joining forces, as we are, at least in this conversation today, about fighting for liberalism and fighting against the imposition of critical social justice ideology in our institutions? What do you think the opportunity for that is? Maybe I'll start with you, Eric.
Well, unfortunately, critical race theory doesn't trust a lot of liberal values. They see it, like merit, one of them, as a ploy to maintain white supremacy. So right there, we already start off with a problem. However, I think a powerful thing in bringing people together, groups together, is what Mustafar Sharif, like in the 60s or something, called superordinate goals, right? Two groups want the same thing to better themselves. And the way to get that thing is to work together. It's by necessity, right? Studies show that actually enhances camaraderie when you are both going towards the same goal for, selfish reasons, but you need each other to acquire that. What that goal is the question, right? Since a lot of anti-racists don't trust classical liberal values, liberal democracy is, probably not the best goal right now. But what is? I have no idea. I wish I had an answer for you. I do think that has to be the topic of conversation, not just among Blacks and Jews, but within society.
Right. David, what do you think about liberal democracy as a kind of agenda, and expanded, if you will, to criminal justice reform as well? To what degree do you think there's a common agenda for Jews and Blacks on the issue of criminal justice reform, or liberal democracy, or both?
First, to discuss liberal democracy, I think the fight for the liberal values of democracy is the primary challenge that is attacking the democratic world in general right now. And everyone who believes in democracy needs to fight for it. Democracy can only flourish if we're not afraid to express our opinions and disagree in each other. As I learned democracy way back in school, the most basic thing we're fighting for is majority rule and minority rights. And if the minority is silenced and we're unable to listen to them, we can't stand up for their rights. And this critical race theory idea of silencing all of the opposition is just way too similar to the Cultural Revolution of China, where there's the party line, you have to stick with the party line, and no other thoughts or ideas are acceptable. And that is the end of the democracy and the beginning of a totalitarian regime where your thoughts are monitored and disagreement is enough to get you incarcerated or punished. As far as both the Blacks and the Jews working together on criminal justice reform, I think that they are a perfect match for the task. African Americans and Black people, and really brown people of all different kinds, have suffered the most from our current system of mass incarceration, which is unequivocally a terrible human rights violation that we need to look at and fix and have a reckoning with. And I think a lot of the experiences that come from Jewish culture and Jewish history can help us come to a positive reckoning when it comes to acknowledging what has gone wrong in the past, but more importantly, focusing on building a better future. We can disagree about how systemically racist it is, about how it became that way, whether or not that's way, who's responsible. But we want to use our knowledge of the past to look at our present situation to create a better future. And I believe that is part of the Jewish idea of how we approach the world. And it's also how the Black community needs to look at the situation in the world so we can all step into a better future together.
Great. Brandy, what do you think?
When I think about liberal democratic values, I think about two things. One, freedom of expression, to have the space to disagree, to not toe the party line without fear of punishment. And the other is the building of civil society. So one of the things that democracies have is civil society, and those are, in my opinion, built in K through 12 public schools. That's where civics is built. That's where learning about what makes up the community you live in, learning all of that happens in schooling. And the idea that's coming out of the extreme left right now is erasing and acknowledging all of those things that actually build liberal democracy. So what happens is you have one ideology pushed at the expense of free thought. And so figuring out how do two communities, how does the Black American and Jewish American community work together to achieve anything, whether it's criminal justice reform or any other human rights issue, in an environment that doesn't allow freedom of expression without fear of punishment from, something extreme, what happens in an authoritarian regime, like being jailed or not getting tenure in a university because you're not spewing the same liberal rhetoric that the university or department wants to push. Anything like that equals punishment. And if there isn't the space to actually express ideology and have discourse and discussion without fear of punishment, I worry that the foundations of liberal democracy won't hold or can't hold.
Right. Thank you. So we continue to get some questions from the audience. I'd urge others to do so. And there seems to be a lot of interest in sort of going back to this issue of colorblindness. It's not every day that we're able to discuss this openly, and I think people naturally have some pent-up views that they want to get out there. So I want to read a couple of these comments and see if we can talk about identity and colorblindness. It's interesting, we're talking about colorblindness, and yet we are having a discussion on Black-Jewish relations, which inherently invokes the idea of color. Helen Pluckrose, who's one of the great thinkers in the sphere of liberalism, wrote in, interesting thoughts on colorblindness. I think the term should only apply to a principle of not evaluating people by their race. It shouldn't be a pressure, there shouldn't be pressure not to have a cultural identity. And she goes on to say that equality doesn't have to be sameness. If someone's Caribbean culture is important to them, this just means it is part of them, like my British tea drinking is part of me, not superior or inferior. And Andrew Peston, who's an academic and thinker, added, "How the classic question: how to simultaneously promote real equality with affirmations of ethnic, cultural, and racial identities." So, any thoughts on this? Sort of challenge of both maintaining one's own identity, and I think Brandy, you spoke to this, and at the same time trying to build this sense of equality. Eric, let's start with you.
Are people really having a hard time doing that? I mean, I remember as a child understanding what colorblindness meant. It didn't mean I didn't see somebody's color literally. I was 10 and I got that point. How are people still confused about this? I'm sorry, I'm being snarky right now, but I'm really frustrated by people who, bristle with this concept of colorblindness. You can acknowledge somebody's cultural identities and be colorblind in that their skin color is not the most important thing about them and not the thing you look at when judging their skills, their merit, or what have you. That's what colorblindness is. It's really simple. And I don't think it's that hard to acknowledge somebody's identity and not put so much weight on race that it's their most important factor.
Brandy?
I think you hit the nail on the head. You said acknowledge their individuality. Well, right now what's happening is individuality is being ignored, right? Because that includes things like merit. Instead, groupthink is being pushed. So if there's an ignoring of individuality, then what you're saying should happen isn't.
Within the Black community, or
no, within social justice movements. So it's looking at, so an example, okay, we can address systemic racism. I think that, civil rights throughout the centuries in the United States have addressed systemic racism, but they're doing it at the expense of addressing individual racism.
Right. Yes. Well, those social justice activists are the ones pushing back against colorblindness, right? They're the ones who are saying, white America is trying to push this idea that my skin color and identity doesn't mean anything, when that's not the entire point of colorblindness at all. So within those social justice circles, there is this push against colorblindness, and I just don't get it.
I think they're also exhibiting the hypocrisy, because while they're saying, okay, we should be colorblind, but white people are doing A, B, C, D.
Right.
So you can't have it both ways. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
David, you want to add anything to that?
I think it's very important we talk about people connecting to their cultural identities and talking about the differences between culture. And this is a very unpopular idea in the progressive world, that not all parts of people's culture are positive and need to be brought into everyone's future. Things like honor killings. There's many things that are not better or worse, they're just different. Like whether you want to drink, tea with milk or drink coffee, does not matter. But there's other cultural ideas people bring that we should all be able to agree are wrong and not productive to the society we want to build and be able to let go. And one of the things that we all need to do with our own personal histories and culture is look back and think, what from my culture and history I want to bring forth, what edifies me, what helps me create a better world, not just for me, but for everyone around me, and what part of my cultural identity can I say, hey, back then they got it wrong. I can't agree with this. We need to move on and do something different.
So I'm going to pivot here for a second. One of the criticisms of a forum like this is going to come from the social justice left that might say neither of you, Jews and blacks, as the case may be, are really speaking for your communities. That your communities overwhelmingly are ideologically monolithic on these issues. That the true and authentic representation of the Black community should be um, woke voices, if you will. And they could even say the same about the Jewish community. The vast majority of the Jewish community is not having this conversation. As somebody who's been in the Jewish world for a long time and been in these spaces, I can tell you that I'm not sure I would have been able to host any one of you three voices in any forum that I was associated with in the past, because it would have been viewed as me cherry picking somebody from the Black community who represents a view that I might be sympathetic with, but doesn't really represent their community. How do you think of that challenge first, and what do we do about it second?
I guess I can go. I am not here. Let me just be clear about that. Representing the Black community, that would be hypocritical on my part, since I'm a co-founder of Free Black Thought, which is all about viewpoint diversity in the Black community. I also have an issue with these two ideas. Am I a Black person named Eric Smith, or am I Eric Smith who happens to be Black? Right? Those are two different takes on what we're talking about right now regarding representation and things like that. I typically go with I'm Eric Smith who happens to be Black. Other people do the other way. That's fine. But the fact that, those two ideas coexist within Black communities is something that isn't acknowledged enough. And I plan, and my co-founders of Free Black Thought plan on expressing loudly and often that those viewpoints are there.
Great. Brandy,
I find
what do
it
you think about this authentic representation idea?
I find it interesting that anyone who self-proclaims to be progressive would want to think that they have any idea of what represents anything. I find that a very entitled position to take, to say what one person represents or who they represent or no. Most people believe like I believe. It's very egotistical. And I agree with what Eric said. I'm here representing Brandy. That's who I am. There has been a lot of conversation and discussion where people are pushing, no, most people agree with us. And when it comes to polling or in the political world, a lot of that has just been proven to not be true. I think that there's this idea that, there are more, what is the term? The silent majority. And every time that idea has been pushed, it's been proven false. And there's been this erasure of moderation and moderates and pragmatism and rationality that I think isn't really reflective of many different communities, at least in the United States.
Great, thank you. David, thoughts?
Speaking to that person, I would tell them this. When I speak my thoughts and my views, they are the accumulation of my life experiences and what I've learned so far to date. And when it comes to someone who is woke, who is in college or super liberal and have met the Black people around college and seen terrible things happen to Black people on TV, telling me what people in the Black community think. I just want them to know, have you ever been to the projects? Have you ever been inside prison? There are the places where a lot of this injustice is happening. And if you take the time to go to those places and talk to the people and really see what their life is like, what they feel, and what things they want to change in society, you'll probably very quickly find out that the person who's incarcerated for selling drugs doesn't care about the microaggression on Twitter. He cares about being able to get out and make an honest living and support his family and maintain his freedom. And our society does not do a good job of empowering that man to be able to do those things.
Hear, hear.
So we've got work to do together on that issue. So the issue I want to talk about for a second is the discourse around Jews of color. And I think we have two Jews of color on this call, as we've said. Jews of color, it's probably a category that probably 10 years ago you didn't hear much. There's certainly been Black Jews and other Jews of color for an entire American Jewish experience. But the way that the discourse has emerged is that Jews of color are sort of a category of oppression within the Jewish community, that they have been largely excluded in Jewish life, that they haven't been widely recognized, that Jews of color have faced indignities, and I've seen this, so I'm not discounting it, that they face indignities in synagogue where somebody might say, think that they're the help. And then find out that they're actually just a congregant or a visiting person, and so forth. I know, David, you faced your own challenges in Israel with Aliyah, becoming a citizen in Israel. And there's another more recent charge I've heard that that white Jews have been complicit in white supremacy as well, and that's part of the Black Jewish experience in America is with their fellow Jews is complicity in white supremacy. Can you tell me what you think about the category of Jews of color and what you think the Jewish community needs to do to live up to its own highest ideals? And why don't I start with Brandy on that?
I reject those terms. I don't use white Jews and Jews of color, or Jews, a Jew is a Jew. I think that it's very American-centric. And I also acknowledge that as a Black Jewish woman going into a non-Black Jewish space, I've faced some of the things that you've mentioned before. And I think that really is just reflective of American society that isn't necessarily rooted in racism, but more so colorism. So the idea that a Jewish person looks only like this, we tend in the United States to shrink people down to really small boxes, communities, to making them very, very, very small. And that's the only way that you could possibly be Jewish, or the only way you could be Black, or the only way you could be a woman is to be fit in this very small, tiny mold. Jewish people predate race. And we don't get that idea in the United States because we're very American-centric here. We don't get a more international and global point of view. And that doesn't mean just non-Jews have that. I think the Jewish Americans also adopt a lot of that American-centric ideology. And I think that's part of the reason that people like me have faced the issues we faced going into non-Black Jewish spaces.
David, what do you think?
I think the key to dealing with this is education and exposure. When I say education, is just bringing more stories of Jews of different cultures, different heritages, and different races into the discourse about the Jewish people so that people can see and hear about themselves so they can know about them. And next is just repetition and exposure. Kind of, you can hear one story about a Black Jew, and it's not enough to break the paradigm you have in your head of that's not what a Jew looks like. The thing that will break that is just you being exposed to enough of them that you become used to the idea and it's no longer abnormal. And it's something we see in Israel too. Like all the time, I'll be in the supermarket or walking down the street and someone will stop me and be like, "Oh, are you Jewish?" Now, I walk around and I wear a kippah and my tzitzits are hanging out and I'm generally speaking Hebrew. Like those are three pretty good signs that I'm probably Jewish, regardless of what my skin color looks like. But it takes people, like, they always double take when they see that, and they feel the need to start the conversation by asking that question instead of saying, like, oh, I see you're Jewish and you have an English accent. Can you tell me more about where you come from? It always starts off with the, are you Jewish? And that is a place of, again, ignorance and exposure, which we could do better with in Israel by just more interaction between the communities. And there's plenty of Black Jews in Israel. There's a huge Ethiopian community, and there's plenty of Black Jews worldwide. But as they grow to prominence and people see more of them, it won't just feel like something that's the odd one out or strange. It'll become normalized, and that's a process that takes time and repetitions.
Eric, do you have any thoughts on this idea of being Jewish and Black or Jews of color?
I have nothing to contribute to this aspect of the conversation. I am not Jewish. I don't have that experience, so I am going to shut up and listen.
Okay, gotcha. So Helen Pluck-Rose again mentioned that David Ben Moshe was speaking of class issues here, and it's something that I'm wondering if we can explore for a minute. We talk a lot about race and racism, but it sometimes seems to me that underneath some of the disparities that we talk about, which are often attributed to racism, what we really can find is class. And economic issues. I've seen that with the health disparities, that once you control for class, you find that some of the racial disparities are really class disparities, and that poor white people or Latino people face some of the same health disparities that Black people do. And I'm wondering if you can hit on that. To what degree do some of these disparities that we're seeing and debating in the public sphere, are they really functions of class and not race? We could start with Eric on that one.
I think it's mostly class, really, and has been for quite some time. I think middle and upper middle class sensibilities align more with classical liberal values, and it's more normalized in middle and upper middle class circles. So to abide by those isn't to sell out or to imitate or something like that. So this idea that if you're successful and if you are fulfilled, then you must have done something wrong. You must be, helping the oppressor or wanting to be the oppressor or something like that. That ignores, social construction within socioeconomic circles, right? Middle and upper middle class people tend to have different avenues or different resources available to them that others don't. And, abiding by those resources, again, tends to align with looking at classical liberal values as a good thing, right? So that's my answer.
David, what do you think?
I'm going to disagree with that slightly. I don't think that class is the main underlying issue. I think we look at the problem of disparity in our modern world, we need to always consider it what I like to call a multifactorial problem, in that we have many, many different factors playing in, and they're all interacting in ways that aren't really predictable, because we can't do that fun thing they do in science, where let's get all the variables exactly the same and change just one variable and then measure the results. Because it's so complex and intertwined, and race has an effect on class has an effect on race. We talk about different groups in the country of the United States, like when people came to the country has a big effect on them. A lot of new immigrants tend to be highly successful very quickly, such as like the Caribbean American community and a lot of the Asian community. And a lot of that is, I like to think about the people who have the mental attitude where they're willing to push themselves to go to a new country to fight for opportunity, which is a difficult thing, are the type of people who will probably be successful, instead of like the people who are like, you know what, things are okay right here, I'm just gonna like hang out. And I don't like to say what issue is the main issue. I don't think it's race. I don't think it's class. I think it is a plethora of issues that we need to always step back, look at the whole picture, and just think about how we can improve each individual aspect. And as we improve the aspects over time, we'll get a more equitable society that will treat everyone better.
David,
Sure.
In Moshe, can I ask you a question? Do you think we talk about class enough? I mean, yes, there are various factors. Yeah, do you think we talk about class enough?
I would rather say that, we don't talk about class enough. You're right. I'm going to give you that one. I think that.
Well, I'm just asking,
Yeah. Well, I was initially going to say that we talk about race too much, but I think that it's more accurate, like once I thought about it a little bit, to say we don't talk about class enough, because we tend to focus in on race like it's the only one, or as if there's no problems at all. There's a great amount of society that wants to talk about, like, race is no longer an issue. We've had a Black president. If you can't get it together, it is 100% your fault. Pick yourself up by your bootstraps and be successful. And when we do talk about disparities, we only talk about race, but I think we need to talk about all the different factors more. Probably race doesn't need to be stepped at more, but everything else we need to talk about more.
Brandy?
That's an interesting one. I actually have to think on it. I do agree that we don't talk about class enough, or maybe not enough. We don't talk about it on its own. Anytime class disparity is brought up, it's always linked to race or linked to gender. It's not talked about in an experiential or historical context. And I like the point that David brought up. The immigrant story matters. How did you get here? Matters, because that impacts the experiences after you're here and the generations that follow are here. And I don't think that those conversations are had where there's an understanding between communities as to why certain communities look different. So newer immigrants will look at Black Americans that have been here and descended from enslaved people and wonder, well, what's taking you guys so long to catch up? And Black Americans will look at new immigrants and think, okay, they had to have done something to achieve whatever socioeconomic higher status that they've achieved, and whether that's being white adjacent and all the rest of the terms that are kind of being thrown out there. I mean, there isn't a real understanding in the history of what David mentioned and said, that who comes here and when the first wave comes and then the second wave of immigration, like the generations that follow, and what that means for their socioeconomic status.
We've gotten one question from Benjamin Pollack that the net worth of Black people is far lower than other groups. What do our panelists think of some form of reparations to help ameliorate that disparity? Eric, you want to start? What's your view on reparations? I actually have no idea what you think about reparations.
Do I want to start? No, but I will. This is a difficult issue, because in what form are these reparations coming, right? Is it institutional, right? Are we going to fund institutions in certain communities, like education, for example, and make that comparable to the best schools in the country? Are we going to just hand over money, right? These things have to be discussed. And what's more, there has to be an agreement on what to do with these reparations, right? How are we going to use this money? Are we going to use it and put it into the community? Are we going to use it individually and create upward mobility that way? All this is to say, I have no idea.
Brandy?
When the question of reparations comes up, the first thing that I ask, I'll answer a question with a question, is what are you paying back for? If you're paying back for so that, okay, this community can have equal financial status to this community, then I say, no, that's not an excuse for reparations. If you're talking about paying back a people that gave free labor, unpaid labor, okay, what form would they come in? I mean, this isn't about, okay, every white American has to write a check every month and that type of thing that where the conversation devolves down into. You're talking about, okay, well, the United States as a country benefited off of the free labor of generations of enslaved people, and these are their descendants. So, okay, tax breaks or not paying taxes in this, maybe. But I think it's more complicated than we have time for here. But also then the conversations really go, what's being repaid?
David?
So I get to go last, and I still don't have a good answer. I mean, it is so complex on so many levels. Like, I don't believe that just handing people money ever solves any problem, because if you don't have the education to back up how to use that money responsibly, it just gets wasted. We also can talk about like who gets it. Like, you have to be the direct descendant of an African American slave. Say your ancestors came over after slavery and weren't actually enslaved, but you still look black. So you had to deal with like the racial tensions, but you didn't do the free labor. Like, do you get the check too? Does like a new immigrant from an African country get it because they've lived a few years having to live with the stigma of the way they look? I really have no idea what reparations could look like, and whether or not I would think they're a good idea completely depends on what it looks like and how it helps people and how it makes our society better. What I think is a better question to ask is how we can show not just America, but the world, that we've honestly come to a reckoning and an admittance of the things that went wrong in the development in this country, and a commitment to make the country better. I thought of that when I was watching, there's an excellent TED Talk by a guy named Brian Stevenson. And in his TED Talk, he brought up something, because I used to think that like, oh, America has dealt with all of the wrongs, they've admitted that they're wrong, like there's still wrong things going on, we need to admit those are wrong and fix it. But I think the problem goes deeper than that because of something I heard in this TED Talk. In the TED Talk, he talks about going to Germany and speaking with someone about the death penalty in America. And one of the lawyers comes to him after the talk and says, we couldn't have the death penalty in Germany. With our history of murdering people systemically, we couldn't have any sort of program that was killing people under the guidance of law for any reason, because just we know what we did, and there's the fear that the system could be used in the wrong way. And then he responds back that he's never really thought of it that way, but if Germany had capital punishment and for some reason were murdering people that happened to be predominantly Jewish, it would make him very uncomfortable. And it seems like it would make the Germans very uncomfortable. But in America, where we go from slavery to Jim Crow to a prison system that predominantly is incarcerating African Americans, and still so many people can't see that there's any racial problem at any step of the way, I think shows that we need to come to a reckoning that these problems can happen, and not only fix them now, but work on preventing them in the future.
Thank you for that. I'm looking through my crystal ball, and I see a very rich conversation in the future on reparations with some heterodox thinkers and voices to really explore this topic further. So one last question. We're running out of time here, but there was apparently a very robust conversation going on in the background here about terminology and whether we should use terms like woke, whether we should talk about critical race theory, which some argue is an academic idea, whether we should use the term critical social justice, which I tend to use a lot, whether we should use racial essentialism or anti-racism. Can you all give your sense of what the terminology ought to be? Hopefully one day we're going to settle this and we know what to talk about. Eric, what?
Regarding critical race theory, when people say, well, that's a right-wing talking point meant to demonize the left, I think it's more accurate to say something like critical social justice or critical white studies. Robin DiAngelo herself refers to herself as a critical social justice scholar and not necessarily critical race theory. Now, critical race theorists and white studies scholars do overlap to some degree. But what we're seeing in, K through 12 in college, those are the manifestations of the tenets of anti-racist education that come from the likes of Robin DiAngelo and her ilk. So I'm starting to say critical social justice instead of critical race theory, just to make that distinction, and we'll see what they say about that.
Beautiful. Brandy?
I think that language shifts and changes, and the point of it is so that the message is understood. So I think that it's going to continue to be fluid so that the message is understood. So whether it's CRT or CSJ or anything else, I think it's going to continue to evolve.
What do you think, David?
I pretty much have exactly the same answer as Brian just gave you. When I think about language, I think the language you should use depends 100% on the context that you find yourself in. Language to me is about two things: expression and understanding. If I can express myself in a way that feels accurate to me, you can understand me in a way that's accurate to what I was trying to express, then the language did the job. And as you chase language, it keeps changing. And also, I think the biggest thing we should be concerned about when it comes to what language we use is what context are we speaking in and who's the audience that we're speaking to, so that our message can be well received. Sometimes certain words will just turn people off to the point where they won't listen to anything you say because you use a different word or phrase. In that case, you should avoid that word, because when we talk about the free expression of ideas, part of it is people listening to you no matter what you have to say, but part of it is also you expressing yourself in a way that will speak to them. And that's part of how we change minds, not just yelling about like this word means this, that word means this, or using words that confuse people or aggravate or frustrate people.
Great. So one proposition that I did not include in my list of propositions at the beginning, and I think I've learned from this conversation, I would add, which is perhaps us Blacks and Jews and Black Jews have something to show society. We can model a new discourse, a sensitive discourse, but an honest discourse around race and racism and around the social problems that we collectively face. And I hope we've done that today, and I hope we can continue doing that in the future. And this has certainly given us a lot to think about and a lot to plan for in the future. So I want to thank our panelists, David, Eric, and Brandy. Thank you so much for this very rich conversation. And thank all our viewers and supporters for being there for us and for supporting our organizations. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.